Karl Marx's historical materialism is one of the philosophic projects of the last 2 centuries that has irrevocably changed the nature not only of philosophic speculation, but obviously of geopolitical realities, of social struggles, and also of historical and sociological analysis. In many ways, Marxism is a very broadly synthetic intellectual project, bringing together elements of aesthetic theory, of moral theory, of epistemology, of metaphysics, much of which is very much, how to put it, dated. Marx is very much useful as a barometer of intellectual fashion. A romantic poet in his youth, and a great student of positivist science when positivism was in fashion in the latter half of the century. Nonetheless, there is a certain core of Marx's oeuvre, or how to put it, a certain part of his project, which has retained a certain currency even to this day. And that, I would urge, is Marx's historical materialism, his interpretation of history, and his very rich sociological analysis. I think if you would study any current historiography, American history, European history, world history, I think you would find that it is, even among people who would not consider themselves Marxists, strongly tinctured by Marxian analyses and Marxian posits. So what I'm going to try and give you here is to disentangle one certain thread of the whole project of Marxism, the historical materialism, and offer for you a rational reconstruction of it, which I have culled from reading a wide variety of his sources. I should begin by noting that Marx was profoundly affected by Hegelian philosophy, Kantian moral theory, French political communism, specifically of Babeuf, and British political economy. And towards the end of his life, that becomes increasingly important to him. He's very much eager to inherit the mantle of David Ricardo as the great political economist of his generation. Marx attempted to synthesize all of these disparate elements into one sort of overarching philosophy or worldview, much of which has become, as I've suggested, in many ways outdated. But his historical materialism, which has retained a certain amount of freshness and validity for us, is specifically an attempt to answer Hegel's idealist explanation of history, which you previously heard from Professor Segru. In a way, Hegel was the perfect answer to the Enlightenment. Right? We saw that the Enlightenment tended to push a mechanistic materialist metaphysic, which tried to treat Newtonian science as the bottom line explanation of the universe. And Hegel, of course, came across the way you always refute any scientific explanation, with a counterexample. You say, okay, if all of the world is describable in mathematical laws, give me the mathematical laws of human development. And the point is that Hegel pointed out human history cannot be explained without positing a free consciousness, which develops in its process of coming to self-awareness. Therefore, history is a great counterexample to Newtonian physics and Enlightenment science. And therefore, history and historicism very much became the rallying cry of the Romantic generation that fought against the, quote, scientism of the Enlightenment. I want to urge, insofar as he was an historical materialist, Marx and Engels, because I'm going to draw on Engels' works as well. There's a fashion nowadays among Marxists to disparage Engels and say that Engels was all the vulgar part of Marxism. Marx didn't think that. Marx thought Engels was a great companion and scholar, and I would argue that much of the actual historical detail that made much of Marxism accurate came from Engels. Engels was in many ways a great scholar. But their project of historical materialism was an attempt to answer Hegel, to say, you thought you'd found one great counterexample to science and determinism, didn't you? Well, I'm going to take you on your own turf. human history, and I am going to show you when it's done that in fact it is a scientific phenomenon that can be described through laws. That is in fact causally determined, not through freedom, not through rationality, but simply by, as we'll see, a sort of technocentric interpretation of the world. So the basic project in its roughest guise is the attempt to explain human history on a purely naturalistic or scientific basis. Now, in the rational reconstruction I'm going to offer you, we're going to take our point of embarkation or beginning from a comment that Marx sort of threw away in the Communist Manifesto. He said, communism is the answer to the riddle of history. And it knows it. It solves the problem of history. It's one of the few places where you get that formulation, the problem of history. And the question becomes, what's the problem of history? What is he talking about? I want to urge that what in fact the problem of history is really a problematic. It's a set of issues or background assumptions. Another way of thinking of it is in terms of history as a narrative, it's the set of themes, three fundamental themes that interact and arise in the unfolding account of human evolution. So what we'll find is I'm going to offer you these three issues that make up the problematic, and you should be able to see them interact in a dynamic process of evolution in human history. And we'll find that those themes, that evolution is punctuated by very sharp conjunctures. Now, the first issue behind that problematic is one of what I would call philosophical anthropology. The question is, from a naturalistic basis, what distinguishes man from all the other species? Right? What is unique about humans that none of the other species seem to have? The first obvious answer to that, the Hegelian answer, is, well, consciousness. Humans are conscious. But remember, Marx is extremely concerned with naturalism, is very aware of the Darwinian revolution, is a great admirer of Darwin's, and is sensible enough to realize that probably consciousness is the last thing that humans develop, and that all things, all physical functions we develop, undoubtedly serve a naturalistic purpose. So to put consciousness as the answer there is really to jump the gun. Why would we develop consciousness in the first place? What function does it serve in our natural evolution? And that's why he says there's really something more fundamental than consciousness. And that is man, the producer. Humans are the only animals that manipulate and change their environment constantly, refashion it to fit their evolving historical needs and desires. In other words, man, Homo faber, is the only species that produces with cognitive forethought. And in fact, that's the key to cognition and consciousness. That consciousness developed instrumentally. Right? That seems to be the background assumption. We developed consciousness and representations so that we could become more efficient in our productions in nature. Right? That's his first fundamental assumption. Man is Homo faber, that animal that recreates and refashions his environment, that is to say nature, to correspond to and fulfill his changing historical needs and what Marx would call objectifications. Right? His placing himself in nature and leaving his mark there. The second issue of the problematic is also anthropological, though in a much more, I would urge, natural historical sense. And that is that if we think about the problem of production and go out and observe actual producers, we'll find that even in the most primitive modes of production, specifically that which is called hunting-gathering, hunter-gatherer societies, even there we will always find a division of labor. Which is to say, no human is responsible for doing all of the various productive tasks that humans are capable of, even in the most primitive modes of production. So in the case of hunter-gatherer societies, we can't help note that it is primarily or exclusively men who hunt. It is exclusively women who gather and tend the young. And he says that the first division of labor, therefore, was gender-based. And that has profound implications, obviously, for the way a society is going to be organized, right? If the first breakthrough in production will be the development of pasturage. Who did that? Who figured out how to tame the animals? Obviously the men. We should expect to find an extremely patriarchal society with an extremely patriarchal mythology. Contrast that to a society where the first breakthrough is sedentary agriculture. Who figured that out? Certainly not the men. The men have nothing to do with crops. The women figured it out. And he says, if you find that, he doesn't say this, every anthropologist suggests it as well. I mean, I don't want to give him all the credit. That we should expect there to find matriarchal and matrilineal lines of descent, and that the religious icon will probably be a goddess, the goddess Mother Earth. Okay. So that's the second issue of the problematic, is division of labor. So we have homo faber, man is the animal that produces, and division of labor. The third issue, or problem, is scarcity. Again, it's an empirical observation. Every hitherto existing human society has been unable to produce more than enough, or even enough, of the various goods and luxuries of life for every member of that society. All right? No society that has existed in history has been able to fulfill all of the not only material but cultural wants of all of its members. And the result of this, Marx thinks, is absolutely causally determined. One group of society will attempt to enclose a disproportionate share of the material and cultural goods of that community so that they can live a more richly fulfilling life. Let me be very clear, Marx does not have any moral judgment about this. He doesn't think it's bad for people to try to, quote, exploit other people so that they can live a richer life. In fact, this corresponds to what he would call, or we might call, since we've all been educated in the subject, Kantian heteronomy. As long as scarcity exists, each and every one of us will be heteronomously determined to try and get as many of the goods of life as possible. Right? And Marx has no value judgment about that at all. It's a completely expectable, predictable, and justifiable sort of activity. And we should expect to find that, in fact, such an attempt to enclose a disproportionate share of income will probably be based on your position within the division of labor. You'll try to take your position in that division of labor and use it to justify enclosing a larger amount of, quote, goodies. And that will require you gaining, quote, power, either militarily or culturally or otherwise. Now, the term for such a group that on basis of their division of labor is able to enclose a larger part of social income is a class. Don't get too hung up in that word. It corresponds roughly to what Madison and American Enlightenment figures called interests. It's not that distinct from the notion of social faction. It is basically the idea that because of our various economic positions, we all have disparate interests. And we try to pursue our, as it were, class or collective interests at the expense of other interests. So, three problems that are the background issues: scarcity, division of labor, homo faber. Okay, now, we are at the position where we can begin to rationally reconstruct Marx's historical materialism. He posits two fundamental entities from which everything else will be recursively built. The first is what he calls actual, concrete, historical persons. Marx had a tendency to pound the desk every so often and say, I'm being concrete, real people. That's the one posit. The other, the much more involved posit, is what he calls the forces of production. Right, so those are the only two entities from which everything are built. Actual historical persons, real live, flesh and blood, and the forces of production. For Marx, especially in his historical materialism, the story of human history is largely the story of the development of the forces of production. The forces of production, in fact, turn out to be the issue which will allow us to deal with the problem of scarcity. Okay. Now, the forces of production are comprised of two elements. The first is known as the means of production, and the second is abstract labor power. More technical jargon. What are the means of production? Well, tools, right? Screwdrivers, stone axes, plows are all means of production, things through which, or by means of which one can produce. Similarly, facilities or productive spaces. If one is engaged in agricultural production, then a farm is part of the means of production. If one is engaged in industrial production, then a factory or a specific location, perhaps the use of a water mill, or if you're using water mills, of a stream or running brook, will be one of the means of production. And finally, raw materials are means of production. I mean raw materials not in a sort of precise sense, but rather in the sense of objects of labor. Whatever in any given labor process you begin with, we'll call a raw material, noting that it's not always in fact a raw material. It may already have been fashioned by other productive industries. That was confusing. Wait till you get to abstract labor power. It's not what at first you would think. It's simply the mechanical power of the human musculature. Though Marx is aware that that in itself is significant and varies dramatically over time. Right? Certainly the amount of protein we take in our diets will have a profound effect on the amount of muscular power that the human frame will be able to deliver. But it also encompasses technique, skill. And such technique and skill as it actually exists at any given moment and develops over time. Now, obviously the most important version of such skill, of such technique for Marx, is what we would call science. Right? Science is the most important element of abstract labor power that moves forward the forces of production. Because when science is applied to nature, we get applied science or technology. I stress this is very important because subsequent Marxists have attempted to ignore this fact and talk about bourgeois science and bourgeois scientific ideology. Be very clear, Marx did not think science was ideological at all. Marx thought that historical materialism was a science, Newtonian physics was a science, Darwinism was a science, and they were all absolutely true, or at least as true as things get, and beyond ideological criticism. Marx was not a science basher. He was very much a child of the Enlightenment, perhaps the last partisan of the Enlightenment. Now, persons, we have two entities, right? Historical persons and the forces of production, or productive forces. They stand in various sorts of relations. Marx called these relations of production. Now, I'll give you a couple examples. Ownership, right? Any individual can own the means of production. You can own a farm. You can own tools. Mastery and slavery, right? One can have mastery over abstract labor power in the version of a slave. One can own such abstract labor power in the person of a slave. Renting and leasing, right? One may rent a farm, or rent tools, or lease a factory, or for that matter, in a sense, lease labor power, what we would call wage contracts, wage labor contracts. So there's a variety of these distinct sorts of relations of production, or productive relations, and they're constantly going through historical evolution. In fact, one of the things I think we'll see, Marx argues, is as human history develops, at least in their formal and legal aspect, the relations of production become increasingly humanized with each epoch. Now, these productive relations, Marx thought, were strongly determined by the stage of historical development of the forces of production. In other words, a primitive technological state conduces towards rather severe forms of labor control, like slavery. Right? If there are very few labor-saving devices, you try to enclose as much labor as possible, and you enslave people. Contrast that with a culture in which you have an immense technological sophistication, in which case it is no longer, frankly, profitable to have to maintain a person year-round, and you simply buy that portion of their labor that you need on a monthly or weekly or yearly basis and lay them off when it's no longer necessary. So these productive relations, relations between peoples and relations between persons and the forces of production are strongly determined precisely by the stage of development of those forces of production. We take the sum total of these productive relations, and it constitutes what Marx calls the economic structure of the society. Right? The structure is the sum of those relations. And it's worth noting that the structure does not include the entities which are connected in those relations. In the same sense that the structure of a bridge doesn't include the endpoints. It's that which connects. Okay. This structure Marx calls the base, or basis, of the rest of the social structure. Right? The base is part of the social structure, and it's that part upon which the rest of the social structure arises. And Marx called the rest of the superstructure, social structure, the superstructure. And the point is that it is thought to be epiphenomenal to the base. Right? What that means is that it is determined, the form of the superstructure is determined by the level of development of that economic base of society. Now, what is the superstructure? Law, political institutions, culture, philosophy, painting, music, all forms of culture, aside from science, which is the only thing that was really true and went all the way down. All other forms of culture were superstructural and epiphenomenal to the base. Now, that's a rather hard expression. His point is that the various forms of culture we'll find will be determined by the economic structure in such a way that those forms of culture will serve to legitimate, reglement, and routinize the existing economic structure. That is, for many people, a very large and bold claim. And yet, as one thinks of it and tries to get outside of one's historical space, one can see that there is in fact some credence to that. One example I've given to college students is athletic activities. We know, for instance, that the game of lacrosse was originally a game played by American Indians, Native Americans. And there was one significant difference, though, in the way they played lacrosse and the way we played lacrosse. They knew beforehand who was going to win. I mean, the point was not to have one team win and the other team lose. You knew beforehand who was going to win. It was a game of the living against the dead. And if the dead didn't win, they'd come by and haunt you for the rest of the year. So the least thing you could do is once a year get some guys dressed up to act out the dead and let them win the lacrosse game. Right? The beauty of the game was the elan and skill you used in acting it out. But everybody knew beforehand who was going to win. This is a cosmic drama. Now that to us is counterintuitive because when we play games like lacrosse, what's the purpose? To win. Why? What are we doing? We're celebrating our economic structure, a structure based on competition. To the guy who can play by the rules and score the most points, make the most profits, whatever, that's the winner. And in fact, as you watch in any aspect of culture, I mean, Marx was specifically concerned with poetry, but I think more of us are probably associated with the constant exposure to sports. That's a form of mass culture that's very popular. You'll see that as sporting events evolve, they increasingly come to represent more and more of the development of our forces of production of our economic structure. Right? Take, for instance, a game like soccer. There's very little division of labor in soccer, is there? Everyone does the same things. They run around and kick a ball. And then there's one guy who stops it. Very much like baseball, where basically everyone does the same thing, then there's one guy who throws the ball. And then everybody else takes their turn at bat, except for in the American League. They have that horrible designated hitter rule. Contrast that to a game that was created after America was industrialized, like football. Right? It's very much like a factory. There's complete division of labor. There's guys who play in the league for 15 years and never touch a football unless they screw up. Right? There's other guys who will never hit someone for the rest of their career. There's another guy who just does nothing but kick the ball, can't even speak English. And then to top it off, there's this incredible hierarchic control by the coach on the sideline who is very much, wired in at headsets, very much like a factory manager. And in fact, we are so celebratory of our economic structure that all of us know the names of the owners. Right? We actually know the name of the capitalists of these industries. There's Ken Cook owns the Redskins, the Maras own Giants, and Eddie DeBartolo owns the 49ers. And in fact, football fans have reached the point where they even know how profitable the teams are. That winning results in a bottom line. So that's exactly Marx's point, is that it's not some sort of conspiracy or anything like that. It's that that's what culture does. Culture is naturally going to, through a process of causal determinacy, reflect and justify the economic structure below it. right? And again, we can find other examples of this. Look at, say, the sorts of activities that were considered fun among medieval lords. Jousting, which is what? A representation of their life, their warriors. Hunting, right? Surprisingly, they were very much into math competitions. And what sort of play did monks have? Debate societies, right? Always representing their relationship to the means of production, their labor process, their economic structure. Okay, the various relations of production within a given society. They correspond, as I've suggested, to a particular development of the forces of production. Some of these relations constitute an economic structure that Marx referred to as a mode of production. So if you ever hear, Marxists out on the street corner screaming about the mode of production, they're basically talking about the economic structure and its relationship to the forces of production. Marx argues that there have been exactly three modes, distinct modes of production in the civilized West. The first is the slave mode of production of the ancient or classical world. All right, and Marx, by the way, did his PhD on Aristotle. He's very aware that if you read every single classical Greek author, they all have one interesting sociological fact. Every single one of them justifies slavery, because slavery is the basis of their society. Right, he says you find that represented in every philosophic conception throughout the Roman Empire till you get to Augustine, when slavery is about to end. They all justify slavery. So that's the first mode of production, the slave mode. The second is the feudal mode of production, that which we would find in the medieval period. Right? And similarly, those ideas are associated with natural hierarchies, with increasing amounts of freedom as you move up. And again, the expression there in philosophy is Aquinas' great chain of being, that Professor Sugrue mentioned. Right? We don't have slaves anymore, but we still have degrees of freedom depending on one's place in the economic and political structure. And of course, obviously, the higher up you are in that structure, the closer you are to God. And finally, the third mode of production is the capitalist mode of production of the present modern bourgeois epoch, which is distinguished, among other things, by the final formal legal equality of all persons. Now, you've got the elements. Marx wants to offer, or did offer, several laws of development of the modes of production. These are, I would urge, scientific laws, which is to say they're based on his historical research. Therefore, they are subject to revision on the basis of new research. I think one of the mistakes that certain Marxist historians make is to treat Marx as a finally complete project. New research, and Marx did not have the greatest research abilities, new research might well change the nature of these laws, add new laws, etc. They're open to emendation. Nonetheless, I think what Marx offers is nonetheless, on its own, fairly impressive. Well, our first law will be that every mode of production persists as long as it is capable of fostering the development of the means of production. Or, of the forces of production. So as long as any given economic structure or system of social relations allows the further development of the technology of the time, Marx says you can expect that that economic structure or those relations of production to persist. Right? That's the first rule. As long as there's still room for technological growth with those relations of production, you will continue to see that economic structure persist. The second law is that when the relations of production, or mode of production, serves as a fetter to the development of the forces of production, a period of social transformation ensues, in the form of sharp conjunctures that I mentioned earlier. And Marx recognizes that these conjunctures are called revolutions. And he says that's what is the cause of a revolution, is when you've reached a point of development where the social relations of production are actually fettering the development of the productive forces, which is to say, inhibiting the growth of technology, of applied science, then you can expect to see a revolution shortly. That's when that old mode of production has become outdated. And Marx states this somewhat paradoxically with the expression that history never poses a problem that it can't solve. By the time we have posed a problem, which is to say we've found a fetter, we can already see the way out. And that, of course, raises the third law, that every new mode of production gestates as he says, gestates within the womb of the old society or of the previous society prior to its replacement of the old mode of production. Okay, so Marx argues feudalism actually gestated in the womb of the Roman Empire. Where? In the marchlands. The marchlands of northern, northwestern, and northeastern Europe, where you didn't actually have slavery persisting quite as strongly. You had the sort of mingling of the Germanic warrior structures, and he says that's sort of the entering wedge of feudalism, so that once the Roman Empire falls, you already have the new mode of production. You can step right into feudalism. Similarly, within the feudal society, there were enclaves of, quote, bourgeois coming from burghers, in the cities, right? It's cities of, say, the Hanseatic League, which had engaged in extensive trade long before the demise of the medieval epoch, were in fact the first sort of proto-capitalist societies based on contract as opposed to hierarchy, represented by the famous medieval German expression Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes free. And so even there, for hundreds of years, you saw the gestation of the new capitalist society in the womb of the old feudal society. If you'd only gone to, say, the cities of the Hanseatic League or visited the famous Fugger family with its immense mining industries. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why, as you can see, history never solves a problem it can't, poses a problem it can't solve. You've already got the womb of the new society in the old. Well, to jump ahead briefly, the obvious question is, if we have a communist mode of production ahead of us, where do we find that gestating in the old one? That seems to be paradoxical. It's not from Marx. Marx says you find it in trade unions. All right, whenever you see a trade union, you see workers interacting on the basis of communality, or on the basis of mutual risk and benefit. And he says, and that obviously is the first form that we will have of the next stage of next mode of production, or stage of the development of the productive forces. But let me return now to capitalism. Marx argues that the capitalist mode of production is the first truly dynamic economic structure. There is this myth around that Marx hated the bourgeoisie and thought they were pigs. Incredibly wrong. Marx had profound respect for the bourgeoisie. He was aware that the bourgeois epoch was the greatest epoch in human history to date, and was in fact in many ways the far and away the most progressive epoch. And in fact, part of that is that it is a dynamic economic structure. The exigencies of competition, not the moral worth of the bourgeoisie, the very fact of competition forces the bourgeoisie to constantly revolutionize the means of production. Just to keep ahead of your competition, you are forced to invest in R&D. You are forced to create new labor-saving devices. You are forced to fund scientific research. You have no choice. It's the only way to retain the competitive edge. So, for the very first time in human history, the economy doesn't just expand on the basis of the growth of its area, right? More and more arable land. It begins to expand exponentially. You begin to use the same small number of resources and produce a vastly greater amount from it. Each unit of labor power produces far more use and exchange value than had ever been done hitherto. And Marx says with capitalism, it just gets faster and faster. The spiral of the growth of production is just fantastic. You know, within 200 years, you go from the cart and buggy to, you know, the space shuttle. So that's just incredible. You go from the age of steam to the age of fossil fuels to the age of nuclear power. Just incredible. And then the point is here that the bourgeois mode of production expands the forces of production so dramatically that you actually reach the point where it's possible to solve the problem of scarcity. Right? That is the great contribution of the bourgeoisie to world history. They make it possible for the first time to develop the technical means to solve the problem of scarcity, so that we can actually produce more than enough goodies, cultural, material, spiritual, for every single person in our societies. Unfortunately, there's one drawback, and that is that given the disproportionate distribution of incomes under capitalism, the bulk of the population lacks the material resources to consume the plenitude of commodities that industrial capitalism can produce. And Marx says this happens periodically, and the result is what he calls recessions and depressions. And he says, think about what the business cycle is, what a recession and a depression really is. Factories are producing just as efficiently as they were before. People don't have enough money to buy it. It's a crisis not of overproduction, but a crisis of underconsumption. Right? The relations of production and distribution of incomes are causing people to close down their factories because they can't find people to buy their widgets or their cars or whatever. Well, then we come back to our laws of history, and what do we have? You reach the point where the relations of production serve as a fetter to the development of the productive forces. That which stops us from producing more and more stuff and having more and more labor-saving devices is the fact that we can't find anyone to sell it to. And so Marx says, well, whenever you know that that is going to happen, what's going to be the result? As soon as it becomes a complete and utter fetter, we can expect to see a period of social transformation, a revolution. And hence, not his prediction that communism would occur, not his hope, but his absolute certainty. Because as he saw it, each time the business cycle occurs, it gets deeper and deeper, less and less companies get out of that slump or depression, you get increasing amount of oligopoly, and there'll come a point when you get down to about 9 or 10 multinational corporations that run everything, and then they'll go into a deep depression, and it'll be quite simple, you'll just nationalize them. Okay, so there, what we have is that communism represents the solution to the problem of history, right? It says capitalism has offered us the technical means to solve the problem of scarcity, but can't do so because of its relations of production. We simply do away with those relations of production. In redressing the problem of disparate incomes, the last fetter to the development of the productive forces is removed, and the problem of scarcity is solved on a global basis. This represents the end of what Kant called heteronomy, right? Marx said you will always be determined to act by the desire to get more and more of the goods of life. But when there's more than enough goods of life for everywhere to go around for everybody, you won't be determined to act anymore. And then we will enter the Kantian epoch of autonomy. And this is where Marx, has this great synthesis. He says at that moment, history will no longer be about solving the problem of scarcity, because it will be solved. And he says, in fact, that's the sharpest conjuncture in human development. We can, in fact, call everything before communism prehistory, because it's when humans are actually acting like animals. They're stimulus and response machines responding to that problem of scarcity and division of labor. After that is history proper, when historical development is nothing more than the development of the pure human free consciousness as it unfolds in its various projects. Of course, communism will be preceded by a transitional phase called socialism, where the means of production are nationalized by the government. But ultimately, under communism, the state withers away, because the state is nothing other than a means of repression to support an economic structure, and when there are no classes, there's no need for it. So we have a sort of perfectly free anarchy. Okay. So much for Marx's historical materialism. I want to suggest, first of all, what I find powerful about it. And secondly, what personally I find problematic about it. I find powerful its conceptualization of past epochs, its attempt to create law-like regularities. I'm not convinced that all of them are entirely adequate, but then there's plenty of room for subsequent research and subsequent reformulation. I'm impressed by its ability to unify large chunks of world history. That is what I think is quite impressive about it. There is something, however, which is sort of strange in Marx's historical materialism. And it's not the analysis of the past so much as the discussion of communism. You remember Professor Segru mentioned the old Hegelian dictum that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the setting of dusk. What that means, and it's in fact quite accurate, is that you only understand an epoch when it's ended. Right? Subsequent analytic philosophers of history have shown that that's in fact the logic of narrative sentences. If someone were to say, stop into Mrs. Newton's house on the night he was born and say, "Lo, unto you is born the greatest physicist of your age," undoubtedly Mrs. Newton would have suggested that he take a powder. But if you stopped at Mrs. Newton's house some 40 or 50 or 60 years later and said, "Oh, unto you, 40 or 50 or 60 years before the greatest physicist of your time was born," it would have been true. Therefore, the meaning of that event is only clear to us afterwards. And Hegel made the point of this with Greek philosophy. He said, when do we get the great flowering of Greek philosophy? When the Greek city-state is dead. Right? When it's all over, that's when Plato and Aristotle can understand it. And similarly with each epoch. Well, the deep point there is that we judge past events on the basis of their present outcomes, or subsequent outcomes. Right? So, whereas in 1820 someone would have talked about the signing of the Constitution and said, well, that was the birth of our great nation. In 1865, someone would have looked at it and said that was the first step towards the Civil War, a reevaluation. Well, Marx is doing something funny. As I've mentioned, he has all of these fantastic things to say about capitalism, except for one thing. The only reason it's not really great is because it's not as good as communism. Right? He's judging capitalism deficient because it's better than every epoch that's come before it on the basis of an epoch yet to come. Well, he's speaking about a future event as if it was a present event. There's a technical word for that. It's called prophecy. Right? Which is to say, unless you've actually experienced communism, then what basis do you have to critique capitalism? And to speak of communism as an inevitable outcome is to speak of future events as if they were present ones, which is exactly what Moses does, or exactly what Jesus does when he prophesies the coming of the end of the world. I would urge, however, that that's not a horrible problem for Marxism, or Marxist historical materialism. It's a problem for Marxism as a political project. It clearly becomes seen as a sort of prophecy. And incidentally, there are many Christian thinkers who've argued, the British Cardinal Newman once said Marxism is the last Christian heresy. It's the last time where you're going to have an eschatology and poor people are going to take over. I mean, after this, no one will believe that again. I would urge, however, that you can cut that part off, that communist part, the political project of Marx off, and leave behind the motive analysis of the past. And then what you have is, in a way, something close to the first creation of social science. And I think it's a particularly compelling way of thinking about past thinkers. I've tried to get you inside the text, as it were. But another thing you might do as you ruminate over these texts and read them again and again is think to yourself, well, how would, say, the economic structure, in a way, have determined this particular formulation of Aristotle? Or that particular notion of Descartes? Right? Or perhaps the bourgeois role of greed in society might have had something to do with the development of consequentialism in English-speaking philosophy. And it shouldn't surprise us that English-speaking world is the first place to have capitalism. And that Germany, which is relatively economically underdeveloped at the time, largely peasant, doesn't understand consequentialism, finds it bizarre. Right? They don't have that mode of production. So, in sum then, I would say that Marxism, since it is such a broad project, is really best used as a series of resources which we can eclectically draw and leave that which we don't wish behind. And I can't help feeling that Marxist historical materialism may be the most useful part of Marxism for analysts today and hopefully in the future.